Story 1. The figure outside my kitchen window. I still remember that evening because nothing about it should have stayed with me for so many years. Dinner was finished, the dishes were stacked beside the sink, and I was wiping the kitchen counter before heading upstairs. I glanced through the dark window without thinking, expecting the usual empty backyard. Instead, I caught what looked like someone standing near the fence. I convinced myself it was only shadows, but that ordinary moment never truly ended for me, and I have never forgotten it. My wife had been working late shifts for nearly a year, so most weekday evenings followed the same comfortable rhythm. I would finish cooking dinner for my daughter and me, remind her to start her homework, and listen to the familiar sounds of her moving around upstairs. She was 15, independent enough to want her own space, but still close enough to yell goodnight before going to bed. Our house sat on a quiet suburban street where people knew each other by name. Kids rode bicycles after school, neighbors waved while collecting their mail, and weekends usually meant trimming hedges or mowing lawns. After sunset, though, everything became almost perfectly still. Porch lights glowed, televisions flickered behind curtains, and hardly anyone stayed outside for long. Before I went upstairs every night, I always washed the dishes. It was a simple habit that helped me relax before sleeping. The sink faced a wide kitchen window overlooking our fenced backyard. Beyond the grass stood an old wooden fence with a few trees growing behind it. During the day, the view felt ordinary, almost comforting. At night, it became nothing more than black glass reflecting the kitchen behind me. I never locked the back door until the dishes were done, because it simply never seemed necessary. Our dog had passed away months earlier, but I still expected silence outside. Nothing ever happened there. That ordinary routine made the house feel completely safe. And I never imagined one casual glance through that window would change the way I looked outside after dark forever again. Over the next several nights, little things began happening, but none of them felt important enough to worry about. The motion sensor above the back door would suddenly switch on, flooding the yard with light. Yet, whenever I looked outside, nothing was there. After a minute, it always shut itself off again. Our old dog, Max, had a habit of lying near the kitchen while I cleaned. More than once, he stopped resting, lifted his head, and stared silently through the window toward the backyard. He never barked or growled, he simply watched. I laughed it off, assuming he had spotted a squirrel or another animal. A couple of mornings later, I noticed the garbage cans had shifted a few feet from where I always left them. The lids were still closed, and nothing appeared missing. I blamed raccoons, even though they had never been much of a problem in our neighborhood. One evening, while I was finishing the dishes, my daughter came downstairs to grab a drink. She casually asked if I had been walking around outside because she thought she had heard slow footsteps beneath her bedroom window. I told her it was probably a neighbor cutting through the yards or an animal moving along the fence. She accepted the answer without another question, and honestly, so did I, looking back now. Every one of those moments feels painfully obvious, but at the time they blended into ordinary life. I wish I had noticed them before everything changed. A few days after my daughter mentioned the footsteps, I experienced something that was much harder to explain away. I was rinsing a plate when I caught movement near the back fence. It lasted only a second, but I could have sworn someone had stepped behind one of the trees. I grabbed the flashlight we kept in the kitchen drawer, unlocked the back door, and walked into the yard. By the time the beam reached the fence line, there was nobody there. The grass barely moved, and the silence felt strangely complete. I told myself I had imagined it until the following morning. As I opened the blinds, I noticed several muddy footprints beneath the kitchen window. They were clear enough to see, but stopped before reaching the patio, almost as if whoever made them had carefully turned around. We had not had visitors, and neither my daughter nor my wife had gone into the backyard after the rain. One of our neighbors had recently installed a security camera overlooking his driveway. I asked if he could check the recording from the previous night. He was happy to help, but the camera angle ended just short of our fence. It covered the street, his yard, and part of ours, yet the exact place where I thought I had seen someone remained hidden. It felt like terrible luck, nothing more. When I mentioned everything to my wife, she listened patiently before smiling in the way people do when they think they are being reassuring. She reminded me that stress could make ordinary things seem unusual and suggested I was becoming too focused on every small noise outside. I wanted to believe she was right. Even so, my habits quietly changed. Every evening, I checked the back door twice instead of once. Then I started checking every window before bed. If I woke during the night, I found myself listening for footsteps instead of falling back asleep. The motion light became something I watched constantly, almost expecting it to switch on. The house itself had not changed. The rooms were familiar, my family was safe, and the neighborhood remained quiet. Yet every sunset carried a feeling I could not explain. Nothing openly threatened us, but I could no longer relax while standing at that kitchen sink. Somehow, the darkness outside felt as though it was waiting for me to look up again. Looking back, the strangest part was how ordinary every day still appeared from the outside. We laughed during dinner, watched television, and talked about school as though nothing had changed. Inside my own head, however, every unfamiliar sound demanded attention. A branch scraping the fence, distant footsteps, even the wind moving through the trees made me pause. I kept telling myself tomorrow everything would finally feel normal again, but tomorrow never seemed to arrive. That thought slowly exhausted me. Late one stormy evening, I found myself standing at the sink again, finishing the last few dishes before bed. Rain tapped steadily against the glass, and the wind pushed branches across the fence with soft scraping sounds. My daughter had already gone upstairs, and my wife was still at work. The kitchen felt warm and familiar, exactly like every other night. Then the motion light came on. I sighed before looking outside, expecting another false alarm. Instead, I noticed a shape standing only a few feet from the kitchen window. The person never moved. They did not wave, knock, or even turn away. They simply stood there facing me. I could not make out a face because the rain distorted everything, but I knew someone was watching through the glass. I froze with one hand still resting on the edge of the sink. Every sensible thought disappeared. I remember hearing the faucet dripping behind me, yet I could not force myself to move. It felt like time had slowed. After what seemed like forever, the figure took one slow step backward, then another. Without rushing, without looking away, it drifted toward the darkness beyond the fence until it completely disappeared. The moment it was gone, I locked the back door, called my wife, and dialed the police. Officers arrived quickly, searched the yard with flashlights, checked behind the shed, along the fence, and even spoke with neighbors. Nobody reported seeing anyone leave. They found no discarded belongings, no damaged fence, and no trail leading away. The only evidence was a fresh set of muddy footprints beneath the kitchen window. One officer photographed them before the rain washed their edges away. He had told me they would file a report, but admitted there was little else to investigate. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that silent figure standing perfectly still, staring through the glass as though they had been waiting for me to look up. My wife took the incident far more seriously after seeing the police photographs. Within days, we installed brighter floodlights, security cameras covering every corner of the backyard, and stronger locks on every door. For a while, those changes helped us sleep, or at least pretend we could. Weeks passed without another sighting. Cameras never captured anyone lingering outside, and the motion light stopped activating for no obvious reason. The police never called with new information. Whoever had stood outside my window simply vanished from their investigation, leaving behind nothing except unanswered questions. Life slowly returned to its routine, but I never truly settled back into it. Every evening as daylight faded, I felt my shoulders tighten without realizing it. Washing dishes became something I hurried through instead of enjoying. I avoided looking directly into the backyard after sunset, even when I knew the cameras were recording. Nothing else ever happened, yet the ordinary comfort our home once gave me quietly disappeared. The house stayed the same, but I never felt exactly the same inside it again. From then on, Story 2. The apartment across the courtyard. There was one apartment window I could never stop looking at. Not because anything happened inside it, but because someone outside always seemed to be watching both our apartments at once. At the time, I assumed it was coincidence or simple curiosity. Years later, after everything that followed, I realized those quiet evenings had been trying to tell me something. I just didn't understand it until far too late, and that single window still finds its way into my thoughts whenever darkness settles outside and curtains remain slightly open tonight. My first apartment after college wasn't anything fancy, but it felt like the beginning of real adulthood. I rented a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet apartment complex tucked behind a grocery store in a neighborhood park. The buildings faced each other across a neatly maintained courtyard filled with grass, flower beds, and a few wooden benches. Most of the residents were older couples or young professionals who greeted each other with easy smiles. We held doors open, collected misplaced packages, and occasionally chatted while checking the mail. It never felt like one of those places where people avoided eye contact. After work, I usually cooked something simple, watched television for an hour, cleaned the kitchen, showered, and settled into the chair beside my bedroom window with a book. Reading before sleep had always helped quiet my mind. The window overlooked the courtyard. I liked leaving the curtains partly open because the soft courtyard lights made the room feel less closed in at night. From that chair, I could see several neighboring windows, though most people closed their blinds before bedtime. The entire complex became remarkably quiet after 10 o'clock. Sometimes I heard distant traffic or someone climbing the stairs, but nothing unusual ever seemed to happen. It was exactly the kind of place where you forgot to feel cautious, and that peaceful routine slowly became the reason I missed the warning signs that were already waiting outside. Looking back, that ordinary comfort made every future moment far more unsettling because I never expected danger to exist somewhere so familiar. Over the next couple of weeks, tiny things began catching my attention, though none of them felt serious. Some evenings, the courtyard lights would suddenly switch on, even when nobody appeared outside. I assumed someone had walked through, but every time I looked, the courtyard sat empty. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor mentioned seeing someone wandering around the buildings after midnight. He shrugged as he said it, guessing they were probably lost or waiting for a friend. A few nights later, I started hearing soft knocking sounds somewhere inside the walls. They came in uneven bursts, always after everyone seemed to sleep. The maintenance office later blamed old pipes expanding as temperatures dropped, and that explanation sounded reasonable enough. Still, every now and then, while reading beside my window, I noticed someone standing beneath a large tree near the far end of the courtyard. The distance made details impossible to recognize. Sometimes the person remained there only a minute before walking away. Other times I glanced back after turning a page and they were simply gone. Nothing about those moments felt openly threatening. Nobody approached my apartment, tried opening doors, or spoke to me. Life continued exactly as before. I convinced myself I was paying attention only because the neighborhood had become so quiet at night. Looking back now, those ordinary details fit together far too neatly. At the time, however, each one seemed harmless on its own, making it easy to ignore the feeling that something quietly wasn't right. Not long after that, the figure beneath the tree stopped feeling like a coincidence. I began noticing the same person several nights each week. They always appeared around the same time, usually after most apartment lights had gone out. From my bedroom window, I could see them standing near the edge of the courtyard, facing the buildings. They never seemed to be talking on a phone, smoking, or waiting for anyone. They simply stood there, completely still, as though watching every window at once. The first few times I tried to convince myself it was another resident enjoying the cool night air. But something about the way they remained motionless made that explanation harder to believe. Even from a distance, their behavior felt unnatural without being dramatic. One evening, another tenant called the police after spotting the same person outside. By the time officers arrived and searched the courtyard, nobody was there. They walked around both buildings, checked the parking lot, and spoke with a few residents before leaving. The following night, the figure returned as though nothing had happened. Without realizing it, I began changing my own routine. Instead of reading before bed, I stayed awake later, telling myself I was simply watching television. The truth was, I wanted to know whether the person would appear again. Eventually, I stopped leaving my curtains open altogether. Closing them each evening became an automatic habit. Around the same time, one of the older neighbors suddenly moved out. It happened so quickly that most people assumed she was moving closer to family. Before leaving, she smiled politely when we crossed paths. But there was something unusually tired about her expression that stayed with me. A few days later, someone slipped anonymous notes beneath several apartment doors. Mine simply read, "Lock your windows at night." There was no name, no explanation, and no indication of who had written it. Management dismissed it as a prank, and most residents laughed it off. What unsettled me most wasn't the note itself. It was the quiet realization that everyone seemed to know something unusual had been happening. People mentioned strange noises, unexpected lights, or glimpses of someone outside, yet nobody wanted to connect those experiences into one conversation. It was as if acknowledging the pattern would somehow make it more real. From then on, every evening carried the same uncomfortable question. I found myself wondering whether the figure would appear again, and, if they did, whether they had been watching us much longer than any of us had realized. That thought followed me every night, even after I stopped looking outside. Everything came to a head on a humid summer night when the power suddenly went out without warning. The television switched off, the refrigerator fell silent, and every light across the courtyard disappeared at the same moment. The apartment became so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I walked carefully toward my bedroom window, thinking I might see maintenance crews or neighbors outside wondering what had happened. Instead, the only light came from the moon, casting pale shadows across the courtyard. That was when I saw them. The same figure was standing directly beneath my bedroom window. They weren't pacing or searching for anything. They stood perfectly still, with their head tilted upward, staring straight at my window. I couldn't make out facial features, only the outline of someone who seemed completely comfortable standing in the darkness. I stepped backward without thinking. My heart was pounding so hard that I was afraid they might somehow hear it. I stayed away from the glass, hoping they hadn't noticed me looking down. Then I heard something that frightened me even more. Footsteps echoed inside the apartment hallway. Slow, measured, close enough to stop outside my front door. Every instinct told me to stay silent. I reached for my phone and called the police, whispering my address as quietly as I could. The footsteps continued for several seconds before fading away. By the time officers arrived, the power had returned. The courtyard was empty again. They searched the building, checked every stairwell, and spoke with several frightened residents who had also heard someone moving through the hall during the outage. The following morning, investigators found fresh tool marks around the window frames of multiple ground-floor apartments. Someone had tried to force them open, but had apparently been interrupted before getting inside. My apartment wasn't one of them, but that offered little comfort. Standing beneath my bedroom window suddenly made perfect sense. For the first time since moving there, I realized whoever had been watching us wasn't simply passing through. They'd been studying the building, waiting for the right opportunity. None of us had understood the danger until it was almost too late. My decision to leave came much faster than I expected. Within 3 weeks, I had packed everything I owned and signed a lease somewhere else. Friends thought I was overreacting, especially because nothing had actually happened to me. I never argued. Explaining the feeling of being watched was almost impossible. The police never identified anyone, and management eventually treated the incidents like an isolated problem. Life in the complex continued, but I couldn't imagine staying. Years have passed, yet I still notice apartment windows before anything else. Whenever I stay somewhere unfamiliar, I automatically close the curtains before sunset. If someone leaves them open, I feel exposed, even when I'm several floors above the ground. Nothing has ever happened again, but that memory changed the way I measure safety. I no longer assume quiet neighborhoods are harmless, and I never sit beside an uncovered window after dark. Some habits disappear with time. That one never did. Every unfamiliar apartment still feels like it could be hiding another silent watcher outside, waiting for me again. Somehow. Whenever I stay in a hotel, the first thing I do after entering the room is close every curtain. I don't care how beautiful the view might be. Once darkness falls, those windows never stay uncovered. No exceptions. Some people laugh, but they never saw what I saw across that courtyard. After that night, open windows stopped feeling ordinary and started feeling like invitations for someone already watching from outside, unseen, patient, waiting silently again someday, perhaps forever alone. Still. Story 3: The Cabin Window. A relaxing weekend trip with friends became the reason I never stay in isolated cabins anymore. People assume it was because of the woods or the silence, but neither frightened me. What stayed with me was a single image I saw through my bedroom window before sunrise. I can still picture it with perfect clarity, no matter how many years have passed. Everything else from that trip has faded, except that one impossible-to-forget moment that quietly follows me whenever night settles outside, reminding me that some memories never truly leave. Our weekend getaway had been planned for months. 5 of us rented a small cabin tucked deep inside a quiet forest, far from busy roads and phone reception.
Ow.
We wanted 2 days away from work, deadlines, and constant notifications. The cabin itself was simple, but comfortable. It had 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a wooden porch overlooking tall pine trees. The nearest neighbor was several miles away, which sounded perfect at the time. Our first evening felt exactly like we had imagined. We gathered around a campfire, laughed, shared old stories, and cooked dinner over the flames. Someone brought marshmallows, another played music softly from a portable speaker, and everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Later, we carried our plates inside, cleaned the kitchen together, and pulled out a stack of board games that had been sitting on a shelf. Hours disappeared while we argued over rules, teased each other, and laughed until our sides hurt. Before heading to bed, I stepped onto the porch for a few quiet minutes. The forest was almost completely silent except for insects and leaves moving gently in the breeze. The cool air smelled like pine and damp earth, and countless stars filled the sky without a single city light to compete with them. Standing there, I remember thinking it was the most peaceful place I had visited in years. Nothing about that cabin suggested fear. It felt warm, welcoming, and comfortably isolated, making it impossible to imagine that anything could disturb the calm waiting beyond the trees before sunrise ever came. Over the next few hours, everything remained relaxed until we finally headed to bed. I shared a room with one friend, while the others slept across the hallway. The cabin settled into complete silence surprisingly quickly. Sometime during the night I woke because I thought I heard slow footsteps outside. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I listened for another minute, but nothing followed, convinced myself it had been a deer or another animal moving through the woods. The next morning, we discovered that several pieces of firewood we had stacked beside the porch were gone. Nobody remembered using them, and none of us thought much about it. One friend joked that another camper must have borrowed them. That evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, someone noticed a faint flashlight deep between the trees. It flickered only briefly before disappearing. We assumed it belonged to hikers or someone staying at another cabin. Later that night, a soft tapping echoed against one of the windows. It came 3 times, stopped, then never returned. We laughed nervously and blamed tree branches brushing the glass. Looking back, every explanation felt reasonable because none of the events seemed connected. We never imagined someone could have been moving around the cabin while we slept peacefully. Nobody suggested leaving, calling anyone, or even locking every window. The forest still felt welcoming, and our conversations the next day never returned to those strange moments. We simply accepted them as harmless coincidences at first. The atmosphere around the cabin changed without anyone saying it aloud. We still tried to enjoy the weekend, but the easy conversations from our first night became shorter, interrupted whenever someone thought they heard another sound outside. That afternoon, while walking around the property, one of my friends stopped beside the cabin and pointed toward the ground beneath the bedroom windows. Several muddy boot prints were pressed clearly into the soft dirt. They weren't old either. The edges were still sharp from the rain earlier that morning. None of us recognized the pattern, and nobody admitted making them. We spent the next hour convincing ourselves they probably belonged to the owner or someone who had cleaned the property before we arrived. Oh, it sounded believable enough, even if none of us completely accepted it. Later, while gathering more firewood, I caught sight of a dark vehicle moving slowly along the narrow forest road beyond the trees. It passed so quietly that I almost questioned whether I had really seen it. By the time I mentioned it to everyone else, it had already disappeared behind the hill. That evening, just before sunset, one of my friends suddenly stopped talking during dinner and stared toward the woods outside the porch. He quietly asked if anyone else could see someone standing between the trees. We all looked. For a second, I thought I noticed a shape before it disappeared behind the trunks. Nobody could agree on what they had actually seen. We searched with flashlights for nearly 20 minutes but found nothing except trees, bushes, and growing darkness. From that point forward, nobody treated the strange events like jokes anymore. Our phones barely had enough signal to send messages, and calls dropped almost immediately. Driving back into town would have taken nearly an hour, so we convinced ourselves it made more sense to stay together until morning. Sleep became almost impossible. Every small noise seemed louder than before. Wind brushing against the cabin sounded like footsteps. Branches scraping the roof made everyone lift their heads. More than once I checked the bedroom window because I was certain I had heard movement just outside it. The strange part wasn't that anything openly threatened us. It was the constant feeling that someone might be nearby without revealing themselves. The isolation that had felt peaceful on our first evening now worked against us. Surrounded by miles of forest, we realized how completely alone we actually were. As the night grew darker, conversation faded almost entirely. Nobody wanted to admit they were frightened, yet nobody volunteered to step outside either. We locked every door, checked every window, and left the porch light burning until we finally went to bed. Even then, I kept waking every hour, listening for footsteps that never seemed far away. Somehow, the silence had become far more frightening than any noise we had heard before. Very early the next morning, I woke to a soft tapping against the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The sound came again, 3 slow taps, followed by complete silence. I turned my head toward the glass without sitting up. For a second, my mind refused to understand what I was seeing. A man's face was pressed against the window. His eyes were open, fixed directly on me. He wasn't smiling or trying to get inside. He simply stared, completely motionless, as though he had been watching me sleep. Every part of my body locked in place. I couldn't breathe properly or call out. After what felt like forever, I finally shouted my friend's name. The room exploded into movement. My roommate jumped out of bed while the others rushed down the hallway. Someone switched on the bedroom light, and another grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen. By the time we reached the front door and stepped onto the porch, the man was gone. The forest stood silent except for the wind moving through the trees. We searched around the cabin together, calling out, but nobody answered. We contacted the local authorities as soon as we reached an area with enough phone signal. Officers arrived later that morning and searched the surrounding woods. They eventually discovered a hidden campsite tucked behind thick brush less than half a mile from the cabin. Inside were food wrappers, empty water bottles, fresh footprints, and signs that someone had been staying there recently. One officer told us the campsite appeared recently occupied, but whoever had been there left before they arrived. Hearing that was somehow worse than any explanation, it meant we hadn't imagined anything, and we hadn't been alone overnight. They never found the man. We packed our belongings immediately and drove home without saying much. Even now, I remember those eyes far more clearly than the face itself, and that somehow makes the memory even harder to forget. We never returned to that cabin, and as far as I know, none of my friends ever rented another isolated place together again. We stayed close, celebrated birthdays, attended weddings, and still met whenever we could. But that weekend quietly disappeared from our conversations. Nobody made jokes about the mysterious camper or the face at the window. Whenever someone suggested a cabin trip, the idea always faded into awkward silence. We would quickly choose somewhere closer to town instead. For me, the biggest change came at night. I can sleep almost anywhere, except in cabins surrounded by dense forest. Every unfamiliar sound keeps me awake, and every bedroom window feels like something I should be watching. Nothing similar has ever happened again, yet I still check outside before turning off the lights. Part of me knows the odds are incredibly small, but another part remembers waking up to that silent face pressed against the glass. Some experiences never leave, even when the danger is long behind you. That weekend permanently changed the way I rest. Whenever I stay somewhere unfamiliar, I check every window before going to bed. Not because I expect to see someone, but because once I did. That single moment changed the way I look at every quiet place. Curtains close, doors lock, lights stay on longer. Most people call it caution. I call it remembering. Some windows only reflect darkness. Others remind you that someone might already be looking back, waiting silently beyond the glass, unseen, patient, forever haunting me still.